what he has seen with his own eyes 2 miles down under ice are hieroglyphs that archaeologists that he was in, that was the mission.
I knew things that I felt needed to be put out in the mainstream.
Before you watch another video about hidden cities under the Antarctic ice, there's something you need to know. The story is real, but not in the way most of these videos tell it. A real journalist named Linda Moulton Howe really has spent decades collecting testimony about strange things beneath the Antarctic ice sheet. But the dramatic, cinematic version you've probably seen, the dying flight engineer, the NORAD officer whose name she'll never reveal, the construction worker who drilled straight down into a metal wall a mile below the surface, that specific version, word for word, doesn't trace back to anything she has actually published. It's a script, a very effective one. And understanding the difference between what she has actually claimed and what gets invented around her name is the real story here. Let's start with who Linda Moulton Howe actually is, because her credentials get stretched in both directions online, sometimes inflated, sometimes dismissed, and neither extreme is accurate. She was born Linda Ann Moulton in Boise, Idaho, in 1942. She won the Miss Idaho title in 1963 and competed in the Miss America pageant the following year, which is a detail rarely mentioned in the dramatic retellings. She earned a bachelor's degree in English literature from University of Colorado, then went on to Stanford, where she completed a master's degree in communication in 1968. That much is genuinely impressive and genuinely documented. She is Stanford-educated, in the sense that she holds a master's degree from there, though she is not a Stanford-educated investigative journalist, in the sense of having trained in journalism there specifically. From the late 1970s into the early 1980s, she worked as Director of Special Projects at KMGH-TV in Denver, where she produced documentaries on genuinely mainstream topics: air pollution, hydrogen as an alternative energy source, uranium contamination of drinking water. This early work earned her multiple regional Emmy Awards and national Emmy nomination, plus recognition tied to a Peabody Award earned by a station she worked for in Boston. These are real documented awards, but they are regional and category-specific honors for broadcast craft, not the equivalent of a National Investigative Journalism Prize, and they were earned decades before she became known for Antarctica. The documentary that actually made her famous was 1980's A Strange Harvest, about cattle mutilations, which she attributed to extraterrestrial activity. That project won her a regional Emmy for outstanding achievement in audio. From there, her career shifted almost entirely toward what's usually called high-strangeness reporting, UFOs, alleged government cover-ups, and later, Antarctica, through her website earthfiles.com, which she still runs as reporter and editor. Wikipedia's summary of her is blunt. She's described as an investigative journalist and documentary filmmaker, best known for her work as a ufologist and advocate of a variety of conspiracy theories. That's not an insult from a rival outlet. It's the standard descriptor used by mainstream reference sources, and it's worth sitting with because it tells you what kind of source you're dealing with before you get to the content of her claims. So what has she actually said about Antarctica? Howe has produced and released material, including a documentary titled Antarctica: Alien Secrets Beneath the Ice, built around interviews with self-described military whistleblowers who claim to have encountered structures under the ice. One recurring figure in her reporting is a person she refers to using a pseudonym, Navy SEAL Spartan 1, who claims to have walked through a corridor beneath the ice inscribed with unexplained symbols, and who ties the story to a broader claim about ancient Stargate portals connected to sites around the world. She has also interviewed a retired Navy captain, Mark Allen Wood, who has spoken publicly, under his own name, unlike most of her sources, about semi-elliptical structures he associates with the Wilkes Land region of East Antarctica. Howe has featured these accounts on her own platform, on the Coast to Coast AM radio program, and she has appeared discussing Antarctica on the History Channel's Ancient Aliens, alongside other recurring figures in that speculative history media ecosystem, including exopolitics researchers and self-styled UFO historians. That is the real, documented shape of her Antarctica reporting, anonymous or pseudonymous testimony, one on-the-record retired officer discussing surface-level anomalies rather than confirmed excavations, packaged and distributed through her own website and through television programming that is explicitly produced as speculative entertainment rather than hard news. Is thinner, vaguer, and far less cinematic than the viral script suggests, and that gap matters. Now compare that to the version of the story that circulates in videos like the one this script is responding to. In that version, a dying Navy flight engineer from Squadron VXC-6 calls how in 1998 to confess he saw a geometric structure poking through the ice during an emergency landing in 1982. A geophysicist detects massive artificial cavities with ground-penetrating radar and gets reassigned within hours. A Navy construction battalion member drills straight down into smooth metal walls. A scientist at Argentina's Esperanza base has ice core artifacts confiscated and her personal journal stolen from her quarters. And the emotional centerpiece, an anonymous, unnamed retired NORAD officer who contacts Howe in 2016 and delivers the account that supposedly connects everything. Urban complexes 2 miles down, technology still being reverse engineered at classified facilities, structures that predate the last ice age by thousands of years. I looked for a documented source for any of that specific narrative, the name squadron, the 1998 phone call, the NORAD officer, the Esperanza base scientist, the construction battalion drilling account, and none of it traces back to an interview, broadcast, or Earth Files report that I could verify. That doesn't automatically mean no version of these claims exists somewhere in Howe's decades of archived material. She has produced an enormous volume of content over more than 40 years, and its possible fragments of similar claims appear somewhere in it. But the specific, tightly plotted narrative, complete with dialogue, internal emotional beats, and a decade-spanning story arc that resolves into a single dramatic reveal, reads like a screenwriting structure, not a documented case file. This is a known and growing genre on video platforms, AI-assisted or human-written scripts that borrow a real person's name and real-sounding credentials, then build an entirely invented plot around them, complete with quotes that person never said. It's worth naming clearly because it's a form of misinformation regardless of how good the storytelling is. So let's separate the two things that keep getting fused together: what Howe has actually claimed and what the broader, hidden ancient civilization under Antarctica theory looks like against real science. On the science side, there is a genuinely fascinating and entirely real body of research about what lies beneath the Antarctic ice, none of which involves engineered structures, but plenty of which sounds strange on its own terms. Ice-penetrating radar surveys, satellite gravity measurements, and seismic studies really have revealed enormous features under the ice sheet. Subglacial lakes, including Lake Vostok, a body of liquid water roughly the size of Lake Ontario, sealed beneath more than 2 miles of ice for millions of years. The Gamburtsev subglacial mountains, a full mountain range comparable in scale to the Alps that was completely hidden until radar surveys mapped it in the 2000s, and various subglacial basins. And valleys carved by ancient rivers when the continent was ice-free tens of millions of years ago. These are dramatic, headline-worthy discoveries, and they are exactly the kind of thing that makes fictionalized, hidden structures claims feel plausible, because the real geology already sounds like science fiction without anyone needing to invent an ancient civilization. What the actual radar and gravity data do not show, according to the international teams of glaciologists and geophysicists who have spent decades mapping the ice sheet, is anything geometrically regular, symmetrical, or consistent with construction. Natural subglacial features are subject to intense, constant physical stress, ice flow, pressure, seismic activity, and slow deformation over tens of thousands of years, and they show up in radar data as irregular, organic shapes, not straight lines or right angles. No peer-reviewed glaciological survey has reported anything described as artificial. Then there's Operation High Jump, which the viral scripts always lean on heavily because it's real and it does sound suspicious out of context. It really did happen from 1946 to 1947, under Admiral Richard Byrd, and it really was a massive deployment, roughly 4,700 personnel, over a dozen ships, and dozens of aircraft sent to Antarctica just months after the end of World War II. But its stated purpose is well documented in naval and government records. It was designed to train personnel and test equipment for polar operations, extend U.S. logistical experience in extreme environments during the earliest years of the Cold War, and assert a U.S. presence on the continent ahead of ongoing territorial disputes among several nations. Byrd's own later comments about defense concerns are generally read by historians in that Cold War context as anxiety about Soviet capability in polar regions, rather than as a coded reference to what the mission really found. The idea that High Jump was cut short because of what it discovered is a claim that has circulated in fringe UFO circles for decades, but it isn't supported by the operational records that have been declassified and studied by historians. None of this is to say Howe is lying, or that everyone who tells her a strange story is lying. It's to say something more precise. Her reporting relies almost entirely on testimony she cannot independently corroborate, mostly anonymous or pseudonymous sources, whose service records, security clearances, and specific claims are not verifiable by outside researchers, since she has generally protected their identities. That's a legitimate journalistic practice when protecting real whistleblowers in cases like classified programs or corporate wrongdoing where independent evidence eventually surfaces. But in the case of Antarctica, there is no independent evidence that has surfaced in the form of the recovered technology, published anomalous data, or an official leak that a story of this scale and duration, supposedly involving multiple governments and 70-plus years of unbroken secrecy, would eventually be expected to produce. The claim that the silence is the loudest confirmation, the idea that governments not responding to her allegations proves they're true, is a common rhetorical move in conspiracy-style reporting, but it isn't actually evidence. Governments and scientific institutions decline to respond to a huge range of claims every single day, including obviously false ones, simply because responding to every allegation would be an endless and pointless exercise. Silence is consistent with a cover-up, but it's equally consistent with nobody in a position of authority considering the claim worth a response. It's also worth being honest about what no government has denied it actually looks like in practice, because the framing in these viral scripts implies an unusual, almost eerie official silence, as if this were the one topic every government has strangely declined to touch. In reality, the U.S. Antarctic Program, NSF, and international partner agencies operating under the Antarctic Treaty System publish extensive, publicly available logistics and science data every season: flight manifests, station rosters, published survey results, environmental impact statements for every project undertaken on the ice. Independent researchers, journalists, and even amateur radar hobbyists have had decades to check specific coordinates against public satellite imagery, and no credible, verifiable pattern of digitally erased Antarctic terrain has ever been documented outside of claims like Howe's own. That's a testable claim, and to date it hasn't been independently tested and confirmed by anyone outside her source network. So where does that leave the actual title of this piece? They Tried to Silence Me. Howe herself has never, as far as any documented interview or Earth Files publication shows, described a specific campaign of government harassment or silencing directed at her personally. That framing, the retired officer under threat, the confiscated journal, the dying whistleblowers racing the clock before the truth died with them, is dramatic narrative structure, not something drawn from her own on-the-record statements. What she has actually done repeatedly and consistently across more than 2 decades is publish claims from sources she declines to fully identify on a website she owns and controls, without those claims being corroborated by any independent scientific body, journalist outside her own network, or declassified document that directly names an artificial structure. If you want to understand why this story keeps working, why version after version of it goes viral, it helps to look at the ingredients rather than just the conclusion. It borrows the real, genuinely strange geology of Antarctica, which primes people to think there could be anything down there. It borrows a real historical operation, Operation High Jump, whose actual scale invites suspicion even though its purpose is documented. It borrows a real person with real, if modest and specific, journalistic credentials, which lends a whole thing an air of legitimacy that a fully invented character wouldn't have. And it wraps all of that in a screenwriting structure: the dying confessor, the years-long silence, the unnamed final witness who connects everything that has nothing to do with journalism and everything to do with how compelling stories are built. Each piece, taken alone, is either true or plausible. Assembled together the way these scripts assemble them, they produce something that feels like an unshakable case while actually being unverifiable at almost every specific point. None of this means you have to dismiss Howe's work outright or write off everyone who has ever told her something strange. Reasonable people can look at anonymous testimony and decide it's worth taking seriously as a starting point for further investigation, while still recognizing that testimony alone, especially testimony that can't be checked against a name, a service record, or an independent second source, isn't the same thing as evidence. What you shouldn't do is take a script built almost entirely from unverifiable invented specifics, names, dates, and dialogue that don't trace back to any actual broadcast or publication, and treat it as an authentic account of things Linda Moulton Howe has said. That's not skepticism turning into open-mindedness. That's a story replacing a source. The honest version of this story is less cinematic, but it's the true one. A real journalist with real, modest broadcast credentials has spent more than 2 decades collecting anonymous and pseudonymous testimony about anomalies beneath the Antarctic ice, has published some of it through her own outlet, and appeared discussing it on speculative history television, and has never had any of the central physical claims: artificial structures, recovered alloys, functioning ancient technology. independently confirmed by an outside scientist, government record, or verifiable second witness. Meanwhile, the real science being done in Antarctica by international teams using exactly the tools these stories claim are being suppressed continues to map genuinely extraordinary things beneath the ice. Hidden mountain ranges, ancient rivers, ice-sealed lakes untouched for millions of years. None of it, so far, is a wall.